The papers were already on the table when Harriet walked into the kitchen that morning. Not on his side of the table, on hers. She stood there in her socks, still holding her coffee mug, looking at the manila folder sitting between the fruit bowl and her reading glasses. For a moment she thought it was something from the insurance company. Or maybe the car dealership. They'd been talking about trading in the Subaru. She set her mug down, pulled out the chair, and sat. She opened the folder. The words "petition for divorce" stared back at her in 12-point Times New Roman. Harriet Elaine Morrow, respondent. She read it twice. Then a third time. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up, and there was her husband of 11 years standing in the kitchen doorway in the suit she'd had dry cleaned 2 days ago, and he didn't say good morning. "I should have done this differently," he said. "I know that." She looked back down at the papers. "You put them on my side of the table. Harriet, you put them on my side." She wasn't sure why that detail mattered so much, but it did. It meant he'd stood over the table and made a choice about exactly where to place them. He hadn't left them on the counter. He hadn't slid them under her office door. He'd put them right where she ate breakfast every single morning, the spot where she sat with her coffee and her book, and her quiet half hour before the world started asking things of her. He'd put them there on purpose. His name was Declan Arthur Whitmore. She'd been Harriet Morrow Whitmore for 11 years. She'd followed him to Vancouver when his firm expanded. She'd turned down a partnership offer in Toronto because the timing wasn't right, because his timing wasn't right, because she had always believed that what they were building together was worth the sacrifices that came with it. He sat down across from her. She noticed he hadn't made coffee. He'd gotten dressed, placed divorce papers on her side of the table, and was waiting for her to be awake enough to process them. That was the kind of man she had married without realizing she was doing it. "There's someone else," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at the table. That was answer enough. "How long?" "Harriet, I don't think that." "How long, Declan?" A pause that lasted too long. "About a year." She nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee and took a sip because her hands needed something to do, and she didn't trust them otherwise. A year. He had spent a year with someone else while she'd been scheduling his dry cleaning and bringing him soup when he had a cold in February, and sitting next to him at his mother's birthday dinner in April, telling everyone how proud she was of him. "Who is she?" He said a name Harriet recognized. Someone from his firm, young, bright. Harriet had met her at the Christmas party and thought she was lovely. She stood up and took her coffee into the living room and sat on the couch and looked out the window at the maple tree in the front yard, which was in full September color. Orange and deep red, and that particular gold that only happens for about 2 weeks a year before it's gone. She sat there until she heard him leave. The front door closed. His car backed out of the driveway. The papers were still on the kitchen table. She signed them 3 weeks later, sitting at her lawyer's desk in downtown Vancouver on a Tuesday afternoon, and her hand was steady. She didn't cry in the office. She cried in the elevator on the way down, by herself, the doors closed, 17 floors to the lobby. And she let herself have those 17 floors, and then she walked out onto Burrard Street and hailed a cab and went home. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing in that elevator, was that she was already 6 weeks pregnant. She found out on a Wednesday evening in October, sitting on the bathroom floor of the house she was about to stop being able to afford. She'd bought the test almost as an afterthought, the way you buy batteries or vitamin C when something in the back of your mind tells you to. She hadn't let herself think too hard about why. The test sat on the edge of the tub. She stared at it. 2 lines. She sat there on the cold tile for a long time. She didn't call anyone that night. Not her sister in Kelowna. Not her best friend Pauline, who would have driven over immediately and been wonderful about it, in a way that Harriet wasn't sure she could handle yet. She just sat with it, the way you sometimes have to sit with something enormous before you can begin to figure out what shape it is. In the weeks that followed, her life contracted and then slowly began to expand in a different direction. The house sold. It had to. She couldn't carry the mortgage alone, and she wouldn't have wanted to anyway. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Mount Pleasant, 2nd floor, good light, a small balcony where she put a folding chair and a pot of rosemary that somehow survived the winter. She was 38 years old. She was a senior architect at a firm that valued her. She was pregnant and alone, and she chose very deliberately not to tell Declan. She knew that choice would not survive forever. She knew it would eventually have to be reckoned with. But she also knew something else. Something she held on to in the hard early weeks when the nausea was bad, and she was tired in a way she'd never experienced before. She did not want him in this. She did not want his name on this. What was growing inside her had nothing to do with the man who had spent a year lying to her face and then placed divorce papers on her side of the breakfast table. The pregnancy was twins. She found out at 16 weeks and sat in the ultrasound room and pressed both hands flat on her stomach and breathed very carefully through her nose until the technician asked if she was all right. "I'm fine," she said. "I just need a moment." She got through it. That's the only way to describe those months. She got through them. She worked later than she should have. She ate well because it wasn't just her anymore, and that fact, more than anything, made her take better care of herself than she had in years. She called her sister finally in November, and her sister cried and then drove to Vancouver and spent a weekend helping her set up the nursery. Harriet cried too, both of them sitting on the floor surrounded by flat-pack furniture instructions, and it was one of the more honest moments she could remember having in a long time. She had a colleague, not a close friend exactly, but a person she'd worked alongside for 3 years on a community center project that had taken over their lives in the best possible way. His name was Callum Reed, and she'd always thought of him as exactly the kind of person who shows up at the right time without being asked. Not in a dramatic way, just present, steady. She didn't tell him about the pregnancy right away. She didn't tell many people. But by February she was showing, and there was no point in the careful blazers anymore. And one afternoon she was standing at the printer, and he came to stand beside her and he said, "You've been carrying a lot. I mean that literally, and every other way too." And she laughed. And that was the beginning of something, though she couldn't have named it yet. He started bringing her coffee in the mornings. Not making a production of it, just appearing at her desk with a decaf flat white from the place down the street, setting it next to her keyboard, saying something ordinary about the project they were both working on, and sitting down in the chair across from her. It became a ritual. She found she looked forward to it more than she let herself think about. Then came March. She was in her 34th week. She'd been feeling off since the night before. Not quite right in a way she couldn't specify. She was at her desk at 9 a.m. when the cramping started. And she sat very still and counted seconds, and then picked up her phone and called her doctor. And within the hour she was at BC Women's Hospital, and her sister was in the air from Kelowna, and the twins arrived 7 weeks early, in an operating room that was too bright and too loud, and she was terrified in a way she had never been in her life. They were small, so small. They went straight to the NICU, and she didn't get to hold them that first day, just touch their feet through the incubator openings, one hand for each of them, and she talked to them in a low voice and told them they were stubborn, and she was proud of them already. She was still in recovery when she got the call from a colleague at her firm. There was a problem with the community center project, a serious one. A discrepancy had been discovered in the project accounts. A significant amount of money moved through channels that didn't align with any of the approved documentation. Her name was on several of those documents. Her name, her signature. Except she hadn't signed them. She lay there in the hospital bed with an IV in her arm and her phone in her hand, and she felt a cold, very specific kind of dread settle over her that had nothing to do with the birth. Someone had forged her signature. She didn't know yet who. She didn't know yet how far it went, but she knew, with a certainty that she couldn't justify but didn't doubt, that this had not happened by accident. The next 72 hours were a blur. Her sister arrived and took over in the way older sisters do. Efficiently, without sentiment, in a way that made Harriet feel held. Callum showed up the second evening with food from the Thai place she liked and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours until she felt like talking. When she finally came out, he handed her a container of Pad CU and said, "You don't have to tell me anything. I'm just here." She told him everything. He listened. He didn't flinch and he didn't catastrophize, which was exactly what she needed. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment and said, "Do you have any idea who would benefit from this?" She had exactly one idea. She hadn't told anyone at work about the divorce. She hadn't told anyone about Declan at all. But she had noticed, in the months before everything fell apart, that a junior project coordinator on the community center file had developed a particular habit of being wherever Declan happened to be at firm events. Small things. The kind of thing you don't register until later, until you're sitting in a hospital waiting room and you're finally forced to assemble the pieces. His name was Theo Bancroft, young, ambitious. He'd been on the file since the beginning and had access to everything. Documentation, financial systems, her login credentials through a shared project management platform that she now realized she should never have trusted. It took her lawyer 3 weeks and a digital forensics firm to confirm it. Theo Bancroft had accessed her credentials on 4 separate occasions. He had moved $340,000 through project accounts using documentation bearing her forged signature. He had then flagged the discrepancy himself to the partners anonymously, setting off the investigation that threatened to end her career. The motive became clear when her lawyer discovered that Theo Bancroft was a personal acquaintance of Declan's. Not a close one, but close enough. A favor, it seemed, or the beginning of one. There was money in an account that traced back to Declan's new girlfriend's family holding company. The kind of thing that takes a forensic accountant to find, and which looks very different once you do find it. The plan, as best her lawyer could piece it together, had been to discredit Harriet before the divorce settlement was finalized. To give Declan grounds to challenge her assets, to make her too busy defending herself to fight for what was rightfully hers. Harriet sat with that for a long time. She had been in love with this man. She had built a life next to his. She had turned down a partnership in another city because she believed in them. And he had, when it became convenient, arranged for someone to destroy her reputation while she was in the hospital, giving birth to twins she was raising alone. The anger came later. That first day, when her lawyer laid it all out, she was very quiet. She looked at the window. She looked at her hands. She thought about the morning with the papers on the kitchen table, and how she'd cried alone in an elevator, and the 16-week ultrasound, and the cramped operating room, and her baby's feet through the incubator. Then she said, "What do we do?" It wasn't a question. Her lawyer, a woman named Renata Holloway, who Harriet had hired specifically because she had a reputation for being an unmovable, looked at her across the desk and said, "We take it apart piece by piece, and we do not let him see us coming." They didn't. Theo Bancroft was arrested on a Tuesday in April. He faced charges of fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty. His arrest was quiet. The kind of thing that doesn't make the news immediately, but that spreads through professional networks with a speed that feels almost physical. By Wednesday afternoon, Harriet had received 11 texts from colleagues. By Thursday, the partners at her firm had issued a statement affirming their full confidence in her and confirming the matter had been referred to the appropriate authorities. Declan found out through the same professional network, 3 days after the arrest. By then, the forensic trail to his girlfriend's family company had been documented, and Harriet's lawyer had forwarded the full file to the Crown Attorney's office. Whether or not Declan faced charges would take time to determine. What happened immediately was that the settlement negotiation he had been drawing out for months, because delay benefited him, because he knew what Theo had set in motion, suddenly collapsed. He signed the final settlement documents in 2 days. Everything her lawyer had asked for. The morning after the settlement was finalized, Harriet's sister brought both babies into the living room. They were home by then, 7 weeks in the NICU and home, small but fierce, and Harriet sat on the couch with one in each arm and didn't say anything for a while. Her sister sat next to her and didn't say anything either. Outside, the cherry trees on the street were starting to bloom, pink against the gray Vancouver sky, that particular tentative brightness that April carries. "They look like you," her sister said finally. Harriet looked down at them. Her daughter had a crease between her eyebrows when she slept, a small focused frown, the expression of someone working something out. Her son made a sound like a question every few minutes, a soft upward note, as if he was checking that she was still there. "I know," she said. "There's a moment in those early months when the exhaustion becomes so complete that it stops feeling like a symptom and starts feeling like a climate." She lived inside it. She fed them and changed them, and slept in 2-hour intervals and woke up and did it again. Her sister stayed for 6 weeks. Pauline came on weekends. Callum appeared at the door every Saturday morning with groceries, and stayed for a few hours, washing dishes, and holding whoever needed to be held, talking about nothing and everything in the way of someone who had decided to be there without making a speech about it. She noticed, in a sideways kind of way that she didn't examine too closely, that he always arrived exactly when she needed him to, and never stayed longer than was comfortable, and never asked for anything in return. She filed this information away and didn't think about it directly. She had enough to think about. The community center project opened in June. She stood at the back of the gathering space. The one she'd designed, with the high windows and the timber ceiling and the sight lines that let light move through the building from morning to evening, and watched people walk through it for the first time. A group of kids ran across the gym floor. An older man stood in front of the mural wall she'd pushed to keep in the design when the budget got difficult. A woman pushed a stroller through the accessible entrance and stopped to read the dedication panel. Callum stood next to her. He didn't say anything about how the building was hers, or how she'd fought for it, or what she'd been through in the months since they'd broken ground. He just said, "The light's doing exactly what you said it would do." She looked at the way the afternoon sun moved across the floor and she said, "Yeah, it is." She turned to say something else and he was already looking at her. Not at the building. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly professional, and then they both looked away and the moment passed, and she thought about it later that evening, after the twins were asleep, sitting on the balcony with her rosemary plant and a glass of something cold. She didn't rush anything. She wasn't built for rushing. Or rather, she had done enough rushing in a previous life, and she had no interest in repeating it. But she noticed things. She noticed that she thought about him between the moments when she was thinking about other things. She noticed that she laughed more when he was in the room. She noticed that when the forensic accountant's final report had confirmed everything, and her lawyer had called her with the news, the first person she'd wanted to tell was him. She told him that, eventually. In September, a year after the divorce papers had appeared on her kitchen table. They were in his car outside her apartment building. She'd been about to get out. She said it almost by accident, the way the truest things come out. Not built up to, not prepared, just suddenly there, she said. When Renata called with the final confirmation, "You were the first person I wanted to tell. I thought you should know that." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "You were the first person I called when I got the community center award." "I didn't tell you that either." She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. "Maybe we should stop not telling each other things," she said. He smiled. It was a small smile, the careful kind, the kind of smile that knows it's the beginning of something and doesn't want to scare it. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe we should." She went upstairs. She put her keys on the hook by the door. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the apartment, which was full of the low sounds of her babies sleeping, and her rosemary growing on the balcony, and the city outside doing all its ordinary city things. She thought about the elevator on Bird Street, the 17 floors, how she'd let herself cry for exactly that long, and then stopped and walked out into the world. She thought about the ultrasound room, both hands flat on her stomach. She thought about a hospital waiting room and a container of Pad CU, and the words, "I'm just here." There is a version of a life that happens to you. And then there is the version that you build. Slowly, on bad sleep and borrowed courage, piece by piece, in the light of windows you designed yourself. She was building the second one. The twins would not remember any of this. They were too young for memory, too busy being alive in the most fundamental way, learning to focus their eyes and grip a finger and make that question sound in the dark. But she would remember it for them. She would carry it until they were old enough to carry it themselves. The whole of it, the worst of it, and everything that came after. She went to check on them before she went to bed. She stood in the doorway of the nursery, the night light on, the sound machine going, and she looked at them, her daughter still frowning in concentration, her son with his small hands curled above his head. She stood there a little longer than she needed to. Then she went to bed and slept, and in the morning it was a new day.